A routine haircut in a Georgetown barbershop revealed a secret that should have remained buried beneath carefully groomed hair and diplomatic smiles. The scar was less than 2 inches long, positioned precisely where Soviet training manuals specified it should be, hidden in a location that only a specific haircut could expose. Charles Hill had given thousands of haircuts to diplomats, senators, and federal employees, but he had never seen a mark quite like this one. And the moment his scissors revealed it, he knew that his regular customer was not who he claimed to be. Spring of 1958 brought an unusual tension to Washington, D.C. that went beyond the typical diplomatic posturing and congressional debates that defined the capital city during the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik just 6 months earlier, proving that communist technology could reach space before American ingenuity, and the psychological impact of that achievement rippled through every government office, military installation, and intelligence agency across the United States. Georgetown, with its tree-lined streets and federal-style townhouses, served as home to dozens of foreign diplomats who worked at embassies clustered around Massachusetts Avenue, creating a neighborhood where Russian accents mixed with Southern drawls in coffee shops, and where State Department analysts lived 3 doors down from cultural attachés, whose real jobs remained deliberately vague. The FBI maintained constant surveillance on known Soviet operatives, but everyone in Washington understood the unspoken reality that for every identified intelligence officer, 3 more operated under diplomatic cover that American counterintelligence had not yet penetrated. Charles Hill had opened his barbershop on Wisconsin Avenue in 1946, using his discharge bonus from the Army Air Forces to lease a narrow storefront that had previously housed a tailor shop whose owner had died during the final year of World War II. His 12 years cutting hair had taught him to read men through small details that most people overlooked, a skill he had first developed as a flight engineer on B-17 bombers over Germany, where reading the subtle changes in engine temperature or oil pressure meant the difference between completing a mission and becoming another crew lost over enemy territory. The military had trained him to notice patterns, to identify anomalies before they became disasters, and that training had never left him even after he traded his flight suit for barber scissors and began a civilian life that seemed peaceful compared to the flak-filled skies over Berlin and Dresden. His clientele included 3 senators, a dozen State Department officials, 2 Supreme Court clerks, and approximately 20 men who introduced themselves with diplomatic titles, but whose actual responsibilities remained unclear, including Valery Markov, who had been getting his hair cut every 3 weeks for the past 8 months, and whose friendly demeanor and impeccable English made him seem more like a college professor than a Soviet cultural attaché. Markov arrived for his 2 o'clock appointment on April 14, 1958, wearing the same charcoal gray suit he favored for weekday appointments, carrying a leather briefcase that he placed beside the barber chair with the same casual gesture he had repeated during every previous visit. He requested a shorter cut than usual, explaining that the warming weather made his standard style uncomfortable, and asked Charles to take the sides down to nearly nothing while leaving enough length on top to maintain a professional appearance for upcoming diplomatic functions. Charles prepared his tools with the automatic efficiency of thousands of repetitions, draping the protective cape across Markov's shoulders and fastening it at the neck while making the same small talk about baseball and weather that filled the comfortable silence of routine appointments. The request for a dramatically shorter cut struck Charles as unusual, given Markov's previous insistence on maintaining a conservative style that matched the other Soviet diplomats who occasionally accompanied him to the shop. But spring often brought requests for lighter cuts, and Charles began working without questioning the change in preference. The electric clippers removed the longer hair from the right side of Markov's head in smooth, practiced strokes, revealing the pale skin that had been protected from winter sun by months of fuller coverage. Charles worked methodically from the bottom up, maintaining the consistent angle that would blend the short sides into the longer top, and he had nearly completed the right side when the clippers exposed a thin white line of scar tissue that ran horizontally across the scalp approximately 1 inch above Markov's right ear. The scar measured roughly 1.5 inches in length, perfectly straight, and positioned with the kind of precision that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental injury. Charles had seen similar scars during his military service, ritual markings that certain elite units gave their members as permanent identification, and he remembered a classified briefing from 1944 when Army intelligence had shown flight crews examples of German SS identification marks to help with prisoner interrogation and escaped POW identification. Military intelligence briefings from 1944 seemed like ancient history compared to the present moment, but Charles had attended additional security briefings in 1956 when the FBI asked local business owners in Georgetown to report suspicious behavior from foreign nationals who might be operating beyond their legitimate diplomatic functions. One briefing had included grainy photographs of Soviet military academy rituals, including a specific practice where graduates of advanced intelligence training received a small ceremonial cut during their final graduation ceremony, a mark that identified them to other trained operatives but remained hidden under normal circumstances. The scar on Markov's head matched the description and placement from those photographs with uncomfortable precision. Charles continued cutting as though nothing unusual had appeared beneath his clippers, but his mind raced through the implications of what he had discovered, while his hands maintained the steady rhythm that years of experience had made automatic. Charles finished the right side and moved to the left. His heart hammered against his ribs. He forced his breathing to remain steady. The scissors felt heavier than they should. Markov sat motionless in the chair, eyes closed, completely unaware. Charles leaned closer and spoke in the same casual tone he used for every client. "Interesting scar you have there." Markov's eyes opened. His entire body went rigid. The color drained from his face. Their eyes met in the mirror. Both men understood exactly what had just happened. The moment stretched between them like a wire pulled taut enough to hum, and Charles watched Markov's reflection in the mirror as the Soviet diplomat processed the implications of what had just occurred in the comfortable leather barber chair where he had sat 8 times before without incident. The scar tissue remained visible beneath the freshly trimmed hair on the right side of Markov's head, a pale line that represented years of training in facilities that did not appear on any official maps, sacrifice and commitment to an ideology that viewed the United States as the primary obstacle to Soviet dominance, and membership in an organization that had perfected the art of operating in plain sight while conducting activities that would result in immediate arrest and prosecution if discovered. Charles had cut the hair of 17 different Soviet diplomats over the past 5 years, and he had never once considered that any of them might be anything other than what their credentials claimed, but now he understood that his shop had been serving as an inadvertent grooming station for at least one confirmed intelligence operative who had hidden in the most obvious place possible. Markov's training reasserted itself after approximately 5 seconds of visible panic, and his face smoothed into the pleasant neutrality that diplomats mastered during their first year of foreign service, the practiced expression that revealed nothing about internal thoughts or emotional states, regardless of external circumstances. He smiled at Charles in the mirror with the same warmth he had displayed during every previous appointment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the casual tone of someone discussing nothing more significant than the unusually warm spring weather that had prompted his request for a shorter haircut. He explained that the scar came from a childhood accident in Leningrad when he had fallen from a bicycle and struck his head against a fence post, an injury that had required 7 stitches and left him with a permanent reminder to be more careful around obstacles he could not see until too late. The story flowed smoothly with the kind of detail that suggested either genuine memory or carefully rehearsed cover, and Markov maintained eye contact through the mirror while speaking, watching Charles for any sign that the explanation had been accepted or rejected. Charles nodded and resumed cutting as though the explanation satisfied his curiosity completely, moving the clippers across the left side of Markov's head with the same steady rhythm he had maintained throughout thousands of haircuts in this same chair. His military training had included basic interrogation resistance techniques that emphasized the importance of controlling visible reactions when encountering unexpected situations, and he applied those lessons now by keeping his breathing steady, his hands moving at consistent speed, and his expression neutral despite the adrenaline that made his pulse visible in his wrists. The bicycle accident story contained several inconsistencies that any trained investigator would identify immediately, including the horizontal orientation of a scar that should have been vertical if produced by falling against a fence post. the surgical precision of the mark that suggested deliberate incision rather than traumatic impact, and the convenient positioning that would be hidden under normal hairstyles but exposed by military-standard shortcuts. Charles had attended enough FBI security briefings to know that challenging the story directly would accomplish nothing except alerting Markov that his cover had been compromised, which would likely result in the Soviet operative changing his routine, disappearing from observable locations, and potentially warning other intelligence officers that American counterintelligence had identified a method for recognizing trained KGB personnel. The haircut continued for another 12 minutes, while Charles maintained casual conversation about topics that had filled their previous appointments, including the Washington Senator's disappointing start to the baseball season, the traffic congestion that new construction on Wisconsin Avenue had created for local businesses, and the upcoming Cherry Blossom Festival that would bring thousands of tourists to the National Mall, despite the fact that peak bloom had already passed. Markov responded with the same engaged interest he had always displayed, asking questions about Charles's opinion on whether the Senators would improve once the weather warmed up and their pitchers could grip the ball properly, and commenting that he had never understood American enthusiasm for baseball, despite spending 3 years in Washington trying to appreciate the sport's appeal. The conversation felt surreal to Charles, who found himself discussing batting averages with a man he now knew had been trained to steal American secrets, kill if necessary to protect his identity, and lie with the same casual ease that most people used when ordering coffee. Charles finished the haircut and removed the protective cape, brushing loose hair from Markov's shoulders while the Soviet operative examined the results in the mirror and expressed satisfaction with the shorter length. Markov paid with exact change as he always did, leaving a 15% tip that matched his previous gratuity amounts, and he scheduled his next appointment for 3 weeks later, using the same pleasant tone he had employed during every booking. He picked up his leather briefcase, shook Charles's hand with firm grip that suggested genuine friendliness, and walked out onto Wisconsin Avenue, where afternoon sunlight illuminated the Georgetown neighborhood that had become home to dozens of foreign nationals whose true purposes remained hidden beneath diplomatic credentials and cultural exchange programs. Charles locked the door immediately after Markov departed. He turned the window sign to closed. His hands shook as he pulled the shade. The shop felt smaller than it had 15 minutes ago. He walked to the back room where he kept his personal belongings and retrieved the business card that FBI Special Agent Daniel Green had given him during a security briefing 6 months earlier. The card listed a phone number with instructions to call immediately if any foreign nationals displayed suspicious behavior or made unusual requests. Charles had filed the card away, assuming he would never need to use it. He dialed the number. The line rang 4 times. A woman's voice answered with a generic greeting that identified no agency or department. Charles gave his name and explained that he needed to speak with Agent Green about a security matter. The woman asked him to hold. Silence filled the line for nearly 2 minutes. When the voice returned, it told Charles that Agent Green would meet him at his shop in 30 minutes. Charles hung up the phone and realized that his normal Tuesday afternoon had just ended, and something else entirely had begun. Special Agent Daniel Green arrived at the barbershop exactly 28 minutes after Charles had ended the phone call, driving an unmarked Ford sedan that he parked 3 blocks away before walking to the shop entrance with the deliberate casualness of someone who wanted to appear like any other Georgetown resident conducting afternoon errands. Green had worked counterintelligence operations for the FBI since 1952, spending 6 years identifying and monitoring Soviet intelligence officers who operated under diplomatic cover in Washington, and his experience had taught him that the most valuable intelligence often came from civilians, who noticed details that seemed insignificant until placed in proper context. The FBI maintained files on approximately 200 suspected Soviet operatives working in the United States, but bureau analysts estimated the actual number exceeded 500 when accounting for illegals who had entered the country with false documentation and deep-cover agents who had established American identities years before beginning active intelligence work. Green specialized in developing civilian sources who had regular contact with diplomatic personnel, including restaurant owners, taxi drivers, dry cleaners, and barbers whose services brought them into close proximity with foreign nationals who might reveal information during moments when they believed themselves to be in safe, private environments where operational security could be relaxed. Charles unlocked the door and admitted Green into the shop, securing the lock again before leading the FBI agent to the back room where they could speak without being visible from the street. Green produced a leather notepad and asked Charles to describe exactly what had occurred during Valery Markov's appointment, including every detail that seemed relevant, regardless of how minor it might appear. Charles explained the request for a shorter haircut, the discovery of the scar when the clippers exposed the area above Markov's right ear, and the Soviet diplomat's immediate panic response, followed by the rehearsed story about a childhood bicycle accident. He described the scar's length, position, and appearance with the precision that his military training had ingrained, noting that the mark appeared to be approximately 1.5 inches long, positioned horizontally about 1 inch above the ear, and showed the clean edges consistent with surgical incision rather than traumatic injury. Green wrote continuously while Charles spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions about Markov's exact words, his body language when telling the bicycle story, and whether anyone else had been present in the shop during the appointment. Green closed his notepad after 20 minutes of detailed questioning and explained that Charles had potentially identified something that American counterintelligence had been trying to confirm for nearly 3 years. The FBI had received reports from a defector in 1955 describing a KGB ritual where graduates of the Intelligence Service's elite training program received a small ceremonial cut during their final initiation ceremony, a practice that served multiple purposes, including creating a permanent identification mark that could be recognized by other trained operatives, testing the recruit's ability to endure pain without visible reaction, and establishing a physical symbol of their lifelong commitment to Soviet intelligence work. The defector had provided specific details about the ritual, including the precise location of the cut, the length and orientation of the resulting scar, and the fact that standard diplomatic hairstyles would conceal the mark under normal circumstances. American counterintelligence had been searching for confirmation of the practice ever since, but the nature of the mark made verification nearly impossible without examining every Soviet diplomat's scalp, an action that would immediately reveal American knowledge of the ritual and prompt the KGB to abandon the practice or modify it in ways that would eliminate its value as an identification method. Green asked Charles whether he had noticed similar scars on any other clients who might have Soviet connections, and Charles reviewed his mental catalogue of the 17 Soviet diplomats he had served over the past 5 years, concluding that none of them had requested haircuts short enough to expose the area where such a mark would be located. Markov's request for a dramatically shorter cut had been unusual precisely because Soviet diplomats typically maintained conservative styles that emphasized conformity and avoided drawing attention, and Charles now understood that the request represented either a lapse in operational security or a deliberate decision by Markov to sacrifice concealment for comfort during increasingly warm spring weather. Green explained that Markov's file indicated he worked as a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy, a position that typically served as cover for intelligence officers who cultivated relationships with American academics, journalists, and government employees who might provide access to classified information or insight into policy decisions. The FBI had maintained surveillance on Markov since his arrival in Washington 8 months earlier, but that surveillance had produced no evidence of intelligence activities beyond the normal diplomatic functions that his position required. The FBI needed Charles to continue serving Markov as though nothing unusual had occurred during the April 14th appointment, maintaining the same friendly professionalism that had characterized their previous interactions while remaining alert for any information that might reveal details about Markov's intelligence activities or contacts. Green emphasized that Charles should not attempt to ask leading questions or gather intelligence himself, as any deviation from his normal behavior might alert Markov that his cover had been compromised and prompt him to change his routines or flee the country before the FBI could determine the full extent of his intelligence network. The Bureau would increase surveillance on Markov and begin investigating his known associates, but that investigation would take weeks or months to produce actionable intelligence. And during that time, Charles represented the only American civilian who had confirmed physical evidence that Markov had received advanced KGB training. Green provided Charles with a new contact number to use if Markov said or did anything that seemed significant, and he explained that FBI agents would begin conducting irregular surveillance of the barbershop to document Markov's visits and photograph any individuals who accompanied him. Charles asked what would happen if Markov realized his scar had been identified and stopped coming to the shop. Green looked at him for several seconds before responding. The KGB would know their ritual had been compromised. Every operative with the mark would disappear within 48 hours. Some would flee to Moscow. Others would go underground with new identities. Markov himself might never be seen again. The FBI would lose a confirmed lead. Charles understood what that meant. He had to act perfectly normal. One wrong word would destroy everything. The weight of that responsibility settled on him like a lead vest. He had signed up to cut hair. Now he was running an intelligence operation from a barbershop chair. 3 weeks passed with excruciating slowness, while Charles maintained his normal schedule at the barbershop, cutting hair for senators and diplomats and State Department analysts who had no idea that the FBI had transformed the modest establishment into an active counterintelligence operation. Each morning he arrived at 7:30 to open the shop, sweeping the floor and arranging his tools with the same routine that had defined his workdays for 12 years, and each evening he locked the door at 6 o'clock after serving his final client. But the comfortable rhythm of his previous life had been replaced by constant awareness that everything he said and did might have consequences that extended far beyond the boundaries of his small business. Special Agent Daniel Green had explained during their second meeting that the FBI had placed microphones in the barbershop ceiling and installed a camera behind the mirror that would record every appointment, technology that made Charles uncomfortable despite understanding its necessity for documenting evidence that might eventually be used in court proceedings against Markov or other Soviet operatives who could be identified through the investigation. The FBI's surveillance of Valery Markov had intensified immediately after Charles's report, with agents documenting every meeting, phone call, and movement that the Soviet diplomat made during his normal routines around Washington. Bureau analysts discovered that Markov maintained regular contact with 6 American citizens who worked in positions that provided access to information about defense contracts, military logistics, and congressional committee deliberations on foreign policy matters. 3 of these contacts appeared to be innocent social relationships that Markov had cultivated as part of his legitimate cultural attaché duties, but the remaining 3 displayed patterns consistent with intelligence recruitment operations, including meetings at unusual locations, exchanges of packages whose contents remained unknown, and communications that used prearranged signals to indicate when contact was safe or when surveillance had been detected. The FBI had not yet moved to arrest any of these individuals because premature action would alert the broader Soviet intelligence network that American counterintelligence had identified multiple operatives, potentially causing dozens of spies to flee or go underground before their activities could be fully documented. Charles had expected Markov to cancel his scheduled appointment or simply disappear after the scar had been exposed, and when May 5th arrived without any contact from the Soviet diplomat, he assumed that his role in the investigation had ended and that Markov had either recognized the danger or been reassigned by KGB handlers who had decided Washington had become too risky for continued operations. Special Agent Green had warned him that this outcome was likely, explaining that trained intelligence officers developed acute sensitivity to situations that felt wrong, even when no obvious threat had been identified, and that Markov's instincts might have convinced him to avoid the barbershop, regardless of whether Charles had actually recognized the significance of the scar. The FBI would continue investigating Markov's known contacts and monitoring his activities, but without the opportunity to observe him during additional barbershop appointments, the chances of gathering evidence sufficient for prosecution or deportation had decreased substantially. Markov walked through the door at 2:15 on May 6th, 22 days after his previous appointment, carrying the same leather briefcase and wearing a navy blue suit that Charles had not seen during their earlier interactions. He apologized for missing his scheduled appointment the previous day, explaining that unexpected embassy business had required his attention throughout the afternoon, and he asked whether Charles had time to provide the same short haircut that had worked so well during the increasingly warm spring weather. Charles felt his heart rate accelerate, but maintained the pleasant expression he showed every client, gesturing toward the barber chair and draping the protective cape across Markov's shoulders while asking whether the Soviet diplomat had enjoyed the recent May Day celebrations that the embassy had hosted for the diplomatic community. Markov responded with enthusiasm about the traditional Russian food and music that had been featured at the event, and he invited Charles to attend the next cultural celebration that would be open to select American guests who had shown interest in Soviet arts and traditions. The haircut proceeded exactly as it had during the April appointment, with Charles using the electric clippers to remove hair from the sides of Markov's head, while maintaining casual conversation about neutral topics that would not raise suspicion. The scar tissue appeared again when the clippers exposed the area above Markov's right ear, the same pale horizontal line that Charles had discovered 3 weeks earlier, and this time he said nothing about the mark, cutting around it as though it held no more significance than a mole or birthmark that required no comment. Markov seemed relaxed throughout the appointment, showing none of the tension that had been visible during their previous interaction, and Charles wondered whether the Soviet operative had convinced himself that his bicycle accident story had been accepted, or whether KGB handlers had decided that cancelling all appointments would create more suspicion than maintaining normal routines. The FBI's hidden camera captured every moment of the interaction, recording evidence that would later be used during classified briefings to train other counterintelligence officers in methods for identifying Soviet operatives who bore the ritualistic scar that marked them as graduates of elite KGB training programs. The investigation expanded over the following 8 weeks as FBI surveillance teams documented Markov's activities and identified additional American citizens who appeared to be providing information in exchange for payments that the Soviet operative disguised as reimbursements for research materials or translation services. Special Agent Green met with Charles twice more during this period, providing updates on the investigation's progress and asking whether Markov had said anything during subsequent haircuts that might indicate awareness of FBI scrutiny or plans to depart the United States before his diplomatic assignment concluded. Charles reported that Markov's behavior remained consistent with their earlier appointments, displaying the same friendly professionalism and casual interest in American culture that had characterized his persona since arriving in Washington 9 months earlier. The Soviet operative scheduled regular appointments every 3 weeks, always arriving on time, always paying with exact change, and always maintaining the cover identity of a cultural attaché whose primary interests involved promoting Soviet art and literature among American audiences, who might be receptive to messages about peaceful coexistence between competing ideological systems. The operation reached its conclusion on July 18, 1958, when the State Department declared Markov persona non grata and ordered him to leave the United States within 72 hours, based on evidence that his activities extended beyond legitimate diplomatic functions. The FBI arrested 3 American citizens who had been providing classified information to Markov, including a Defense Department analyst who had supplied details about bomber deployment schedules, a congressional staffer who had shared committee discussions about foreign aid appropriations, and a Navy logistics officer who had revealed information about submarine maintenance protocols. None of these arrests mentioned the scar that had initiated the investigation, and official statements attributed the breakthrough to routine counterintelligence work that had identified suspicious patterns in Markov's contacts and communications. The State Department's decision to expel Markov rather than prosecute him followed standard Cold War protocol that prioritized avoiding public trials that might expose intelligence methods or prompt retaliatory actions against American diplomats working in Moscow. Charles watched from his shop window as FBI agents escorted Markov into an unmarked vehicle 3 blocks away. The Soviet diplomat looked smaller than he had in the barber chair. He carried a single suitcase. No leather briefcase this time. He did not look back at the Georgetown neighborhood where he had operated for 9 months. The car disappeared toward Dulles Airport. Charles never saw him again. Special Agent Green arrived 30 minutes later to inform Charles that his role in the investigation had concluded. The FBI would remove the surveillance equipment within a week. Charles could return to his normal life, but both men understood that normal had changed permanently. Charles had seen behind the curtain. He knew that foreign intelligence officers sat in his chair. He knew that Cold War espionage operated in barbershops and dry cleaners and coffee shops across Washington. He would never cut hair the same way again. The FBI placed Charles under protective observation for the next 6 months, concerned that Soviet intelligence might attempt retaliation against the civilian who had identified one of their trained operatives. Special Agent Green explained that the KGB typically avoided direct action against American citizens because such operations created diplomatic complications and intensified counterintelligence pressure. But the Bureau could not completely discount the possibility that Moscow Center might authorize an operation to discourage other civilians from cooperating with American authorities. Charles received instructions to vary his daily routines, to report any unusual contacts or surveillance, and to avoid discussing the Markov case with anyone outside his immediate family. The protection proved unnecessary, as no Soviet operatives approached Charles or made any attempts to determine how their colleagues' cover had been compromised, and by early 1959, the FBI concluded that the risk had diminished to levels that no longer justified active monitoring. Charles continued operating his barbershop on Wisconsin Avenue for another 17 years, retiring in 1975 at age 59 and selling the business to his assistant, who had worked alongside him since 1962. He testified twice during classified congressional hearings about Soviet intelligence activities in Washington, providing information that helped shape counterintelligence policies and training programs for federal employees who might encounter foreign operatives during their normal duties. The FBI awarded him a commendation for his cooperation during the Markov investigation, though the award remained classified and could not be publicly acknowledged during his lifetime. He spent his final years living quietly in Arlington, Virginia, maintaining contact with several FBI agents who had worked the case and occasionally meeting with intelligence historians who were documenting Cold War espionage operations for archives that would remain sealed until decades after the events they described. Charles Hill died in 1993 at age 77, taking with him detailed memories of a spring afternoon when a simple haircut had revealed a secret that changed how American counterintelligence understood Soviet training methods. Valery Markov returned to Moscow in late July 1958 and spent 2 years working at KGB headquarters before being exchanged to East Berlin as part of a 1960 prisoner swap that secured the release of 2 American intelligence officers who had been captured during operations in Eastern Europe. Western intelligence services lost track of Markov after the exchange, but CIA sources reported in 1964 that he had died in Moscow in 1963 under circumstances that suggested he had fallen out of favor with KGB leadership, possibly as punishment for the operational security failure that had exposed the ritual scar to American counterintelligence. The exact circumstances of his death remained classified in Soviet archives that would not be opened to researchers until after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The ritual itself was abandoned immediately after Markov's expulsion from Washington, with the KGB eliminating the practice to prevent American authorities from using it to identify other trained operatives who bore the distinctive mark. Charles Hill's observation of a 2-inch scar during a routine haircut had compromised a decades-old tradition and forced Soviet intelligence to modify training procedures that had been used since the 1930s to bind recruits to their service through permanent physical marks that symbolized lifelong commitment to the organization and its objectives.